Hello and welcome to Rebuild. My name is Michael Belch, and as always, I am joined by my brother Bradley. And we are very excited to do one of our follow-up episodes. The reason we do these follow-up episodes is because we really value the idea of not just having theories about how to rebuild society, how to recover some of the things that have been lost from Christendom, but we want to talk about practical implications or applications of some of the ideas that we talk about on the podcast. And so every time we interview someone, we have a conversation just between the two of us where we kind of review it, and then we use that as a launching point to talk about some interesting ideas of how to work this out into our own lives and into society. I say all of that to say, just because we talk about this in the interview or in our discussion doesn't necessarily mean that the speaker said that in the interview. And we try and reference what the speaker said and then kind of where we're jumping off from there. But this episode right now is going to be the follow-up to our part 2 of the interview that we had with Joel Webbon, Pastor Joel Webbon. And so if you missed the original interview or even the part 1 and the follow-up to part 1 with Pastor Joel Webbon, you might want to go check those out first. And definitely you probably want to go listen to the part 2 interview with Pastor Joel Webbon before you listen to this follow-up. It'll make much more sense. So Bradley, how you doing? Are you ready for this?
I'm doing great. I think both of us are working through a cold right now, even though we're not in the same state, but here we go.
Yep, here we go. Yeah, you listeners, you'll hear some scratchiness for both of us, but press on, right?
So, absolutely.
Yep. All right. Well, Bradley, I'm excited to get into this. And one of the things that we felt like we wanted to say before we start this is some of the resources that we've been reading and listening to. And, Pastor Webbon is the pastor of the church where we are members right now. Some of the resources and Pastor Joel definitely approaches a view of the end times from a post-millennial perspective. And I'm not going to rehash what that means. Go back and listen to the interview to figure out what he means by that. Bradley and I wanted to say that we are still very much considering that. That's not a disclaimer necessarily, but it is to say that as we think some of these things through, we're not an expert in postmillennialism, and we're certainly not an expert in kind of the implications of it. So one of the things, though, that we can say with confidence is that as we look at what postmillennials say and have said, it definitely seems to be a more hopeful or a more optimistic view. Now, we're not in this just to feel good, but we feel like it definitely gives us a little bit more concrete direction or ideas for what we can do with our time and our energy. And we see a lot of the implications of postmillennialism as very exciting and energizing and motivating. Would that be a good way to say that, Bradley?
Yeah, it's exactly right. We're not looking for just a feel-good optimism, but as far as approach to the power of the gospel and what we believe it can accomplish, it is a much more appealing perspective for me to think that Christ can save the nations, not just the individuals of the nations. He will do it through the individual, but the nations can be redeemed. Culture can be redeemed through the power of the gospel. So, again, to reiterate what you said, I don't necessarily know I can't square all of the postmillennial doctrine yet. There's some things about the Antichrist that seem strange to me that we talked about a little bit beforehand, you and I, Michael. So there's some things there that I can't quite square up all of it, but the optimism that comes from it, the action that comes from it, the account for the whole Bible and not just the Bible that applies to the personal, it all lines up in accordance with Scripture as I understand them and as I'm kind of relearning them with the postmil kind of eye on it. So yeah, I think it's an optimism and it's a can-do attitude that has really been encouraging to listen to the postmill guys. And I hope to whether I get all the way fully to postmill theology or whether I just adopt the premise of postmill and take that as an acting launch point in my life. That's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I mean, what I've told some people at our church here is that I wouldn't be surprised if premill is right, because that's how I've understood things for most of my life, but that I'd like to live as though it's maybe postmill, because there's kind of a sense that we are, through our evangelism, but not just through our evangelism, through our efforts to raise our kids to be examples and lights and witnesses in society, we are helping bring about God's standard and rule and his expectation for society. And, look, that very well might be a losing battle, especially in America right now. We seem to be maybe in a death spiral that we don't get out of. Nevertheless, if that's where we are as a country, I'd rather kind of go down swinging rather than just kind of assuming that, of course, this was the inevitable end, and that's just how it had to be.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. If it is the kind of premill view of this is the end and it's going to decay, and like you're saying that at least we went down swinging. But I still again like to think of it as we might be going down temporarily, but we're planting seeds
Right.
for future growth of our kids and of our grandkids. That what we're doing now is the seed in the mindset and the mentality for our kids to take the mantle. And I don't want the kids to fight our battles for us, but if it were to come to that, I want to have the seeds implanted now
Right.
for them to carry on the pursuit.
Yeah, good. That's a good point. All right, well, let's start with something that as a premillennialist, traditionally, Joel said something that was a little bit surprising, and I would even say somewhat antagonistic towards how I viewed the end times and just kind of my outlook on life. And so I guess I just want to say, yeah, it was a little bit antagonistic. I think that was on purpose towards people like us, Bradley. But he said that there is in his mind, a connection between premillennialism and Gnosticism. Premillennialism and Gnosticism, and that was something that stuck out to you as well. Do you want to explain kind of what you took away from what he was saying there before we analyze kind of the implications of whether or not that's true?
Yeah, I don't know if Joel specifically used the word Gnostic. He might have, but it very much is in line with a lot of the stuff we've been hearing in accordance with what Joel talks about. So the idea of Gnosticism is that the body is kind of meaningless, doesn't hold any value in and of itself. And the common interpretation of Gnosticism is kind of a secular interpretation, which is just if the body is not connected to the soul, then you can treat the body however you want. You can, you can do whatever vain pursuit. That's kind of my general understanding of Gnosticism. It's not a perfect definition there, but when you apply it to the Christian idea that the premillennial view is kind of Gnostic, it's that what we do on earth doesn't actually matter because our spiritual soul is the lasting effect, right? So what we do on earth only matters in the sense that we obey Christ in our body. And those two things kind of go hand in hand. When you kind of disconnect the bodily action, the things that we do on earth from the outcome of it, then you kind of get this Christian Gnosticism. I don't know if I'm being clear there, but that's kind of the way I have been thinking about it, or understood people to be thinking about it from the postmill view, Joel included.
Yeah, and what's really interesting, and honestly, Bradley, a theme that is starting to be pounded into my head that's going to probably come up a lot as we talk about things over the next weeks and months is this. Gnosticism started as a theological point. It was a point of doctrine because they were trying to decide the nature of Christ. And some were saying, he didn't actually have a physical body, or that his physical body, he was, it wasn't important that his physical body was not on the cross. Various interpretations of matter and spirit, but it became a problem for the church because people were applying some of these Greek ideas of demiurges and spiritual planes of existence to Jesus. Okay, now that is a point of doctrine and theology, but on the other side of settling that controversy, it came to have very specific applications. And this is where I'm really kind of growing in my understanding of theology is, yes, it was important that the church understand the nature of Christ. But when they understood that, it all of a sudden started to mean things like things that we do in the physical world are not worthless or meaningless. And then the Reformation jumped on this idea centuries later when Calvin started talking about the sanctity of work. Like, why does work matter? Why does it matter if you're making shoes or if you're changing diapers, if all that we have is kind of this spiritual importance and existence? And Calvin and the Reformers said, no. The things that we do physically, because we are not dualists, we're one creature, we're body and soul. Because of that, we need to emphasize the good that we do when we engage in culture building. And culture building is simply using the resources that God has given us for the intentional benefit of the people around us. And, I have always grown up with the idea that it doesn't really matter. Like, if I make a business or not, it doesn't matter, because I'm going to be dead and gone, and Jesus will come back, and that business will have not mattered at all in the grand scheme of things. And yet, the postmil and even going back to this Gnostic idea is helping me understand a little bit like, no, it does matter, because God made the world and we interact in a physical space, and that creates spiritual results, but there's still physical work to do here on earth.
Yeah, and down this road, when you get to the impact of what it means for our theology and the gospel at large, you get to kind of this fatalistic perspective where you're kind of hoping for that kind of Custer's last stand, right? Like, once I'm at the stake and I get challenged with my faith, then I'll profess Christ at the end, and I'll be a martyr. And Joel talked about that a little bit, that the premillennials kind of point to the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. But you get to a point where it's like, but Christians for the foreseeable future, and this could change obviously, but I don't think the Christian faith is going to be challenged like it was back in the days of Nero and in the early church, where people were dying specifically for their faith. As long as Christians are reserved to say, yeah, well, when it comes to that, when it comes to the final push, then I'll stand up and profess Christ. That's kind of a common theme that you get from a premillennial perspective, and I hear it all the time and have believed it for a long time, that as long as I stay faithful to Christ in the end, that's all that matters. But what you and I are coming to realize is that the Christian is never going to find that direct challenge or conflict without calling people to their sin. As long as the Christian is living in their world, self-contained, the non-believing world, the civil government, the culture, they might ridicule, they might make fun, but they will not be assaulting the Christians. And you see that with the abortion debate right now, right? Like, now that abortion, Roe versus Wade is being likely, hopefully, God, Lord willing, being repealed, you start to see them kind of reviling against the Christian faith. And that's when, as Christians make more and more stands on principle of God's law and God's moral values, that's when the Christian starts getting directly assaulted. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, but that those are the kind of stands, those are the kind of hills that we take an offensive approach, and we say, this is God's moral law. We want to live by a moral law. We're going to live by laws no matter what. Joel says it's not whether but which law. We are going to have a law, and we would rather it be based in a biblical law, based in biblical moral law. And as we take those stands, that's when the Christian will start facing overt persecution rather than just kind of this acute ridicule.
Yeah, we have this idea that, you look at the Christians who were martyred in the first century or second century, whenever they started doing I think it was second century, when they started doing in the Colosseum, feeding them to the lions and things like that. And you have this idea that they were all kind of rounded up one day and like, okay, so we're going to take some of you to the Colosseum, and you can choose to go to the Colosseum by, sticking to your commitment to deny Christ or not. And, if you want to get out of that, then you can deny Christ. And if you don't, then we're going to take you to the Colosseum. And it's certainly true that many Christians were offered that choice. But the reason why it got to that point was Christians were standing up and saying, Caesar is not Lord. Christ is Lord. And they were objecting to something that, it was a small, almost unnoticed cultural practice when people in the Roman Empire would give the pinch of incense to Caesar. This was no big deal in that society. And they looked at theology and they said, Jesus is Lord and he's been given all authority. And so we now not only cannot give the pinch of incense to Caesar, but we, many of them were vocal about it. No, Caesar is not Lord. And it was not just a private belief they had at that point, right? They had to choose to point out to culture and to Caesar, to the rulers, nope, that you do not have the authority. That's what led to them being persecuted. And when we were talking right before this, I think we said something like the conditions for persecution are almost always there for Christians. But the persecution in every generation almost has been a choice of whether or not we will preach God's truth or be silent with it. And so the hill to die on might never come for the American church of, the specific doctrine of Christ. I will defend the hypostatic union. The hill that we die on might be when we say to government, you don't have the authority to define right and wrong. And that means you don't have the authority to define a man and a woman. God has defined that authority, and I will not compromise. And in fact, not only will I not compromise, I will tell you that you are usurping God's authority and you are under judgment as long as you continue to do that. But we could easily avoid that confrontation and the persecution that would ensue if we take that position.
Yep. Yeah, and just on a practical note, we look around culture and we kind of wonder why we have a sense that a large majority of people disagree with some of the hot button topics right now, the CRTs and the transgender and the BLM movements and even the January 6th quote unquote insurrection, like just the idea of storming aggressively any space, protesting one thing, storming a space. We all have kind of an idea that we don't really like this form of culture, but none of us want to be the one to take the stand. And at some point, we need leaders to take the stand so that those will follow. We need people people will follow once people start taking stands, but it's going to cost something. We have a reluctance in the Christian church to take the first blow, to be the ones that take the brunt, to be the who is the pastor up in Edmonton?
James Coates.
James Coates, yeah. We have a reluctance to be the James Coates. And, it was discouraging, even in that scenario, to see the lack of people following in his example and basically turning their back on him and hanging him out to dry. Now, fortunately, that situation seems to have resolved itself okay, but we need men and women that are willing to take that stand, no matter the cost, because that's where the persecution starts. We don't want the persecution, but as Christians, it is our calling to speak that truth, and let the chips fall where they may. Our hope is an eternal hope, and that's where the premillennial gets it right. Our hope is eternally in heaven, but the actions we do on earth do make a difference and do have lasting implications for both our life and the lives of our kids and our grandkids.
Yeah, and to that point, there were articles written in the Gospel Coalition Canada about, basically, I'm summarizing here, basically saying, okay, hold on, Christians, don't defend James Coates because he's being persecuted, because he's not actually being persecuted because he chose it. And if he would have just not opened his church, then he wouldn't have been persecuted, which proves that it wasn't persecution. It was just, him maybe making poor choices that went against what the government was wanting him to do. Like that's exactly that example of James Coates is exactly what we're talking about. Well, under that logic, no Christian ever has to be persecuted for anything. They just go along with the flow. But I think what we're saying is postmillennialism has not just a willingness, but a belief that it's necessary to kind of take the truth to the culture and take it to the culture and continue to say to the culture, you in this area are dishonoring God and will face God's judgment unless you and we repent even as a society.
Yep. Yeah. And if any of this is ringing a bell or sounding moderately interesting, I would encourage people to read Doug Wilson's book on this, Rules for Reformers. It really does address the heart of what the post-mill view is played out in society. It's a spinoff of Rules for Radicals, the Marxist book. But it says we're in this battle, we're in this fight, and it's going to take certain principles and certain stands to do this. So if you're piqued at all, in one practical thing you could do is at least for curiosity's sake, if not for conviction's sake, go ahead and read Doug Wilson's Rules for Reformers.
Yeah.
On that note, let's transition to another thing that Joel talked about, which was kind of the idea of God's law and whether or not God's law, specifically the Old Testament law, applies, or we can apply it to our current civil law, our current government. Should it be applied? When is it okay for it to be applied? Is it even worthy of being, is that something that's already been fulfilled through Christ? He touched on it, but let's expound on that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, this is the term called theonomy. And, I think for some reason it gets a kind of a bad rap. And certainly, there have been times in history where people have maybe tried to apply too directly or too specifically kind of Old Testament passages and verses. And theonomy simply means God's law. Theos, God, law. And Joel says, but it's not said in the interview, but he didn't coin the term. The idea is if we are presuppositional, which means everyone approaches every situation with a perspective, a previously held set of beliefs and assumptions, then when people come to make decisions about society, they all have a perspective from which they're coming. And so Joel says it's not whether, but which. It's not whether a theonomy is applied, but which theonomy is applied, because everyone comes from a theological perspective, even if that theological perspective is atheism or secularism, but certainly more specifically if they're a Muslim and they want to apply Sharia law, or if they are a new age, kind of a mystic type person. Everyone is bringing assumptions from a worship standpoint. We all worship something, and that works itself into every decision that we make. And so, Joel's point was we are going to live according to a presupposition that ties back to a religious belief. Why not have it be a religious belief that aligns with the way that God has actually established the universe? And I know people who say, yeah, I would advocate for the death penalty for sodomy, for homosexuality. I'm like, I don't know about that, right? So you can have a discussion about how far we take the Old Testament law, but the first principle is that there's no neutral law. There's no neutral law. Everyone is going to try and impose a morality. Everyone is going to try and impose religious adherence to dogma. It's just a question of which one. And to wrap this up, at least my point here, we were talking about, Bradley, the idea that coming out of the Enlightenment, this idea, and actually it's before that, Thomas Aquinas talked about it too, the idea of natural law, which we get from Paul's idea of the conscience and nature testifying to us and revealing, enough of God that we should seek for him. But natural law has to confine to a moral law, right? Or else it's invalid. And so even there, the natural law is simply pointing back to the moral law of God, which is behind it. God's character is behind the 10 Commandments, and God's character is behind the natural law. And natural law, the implementation of it as a political system, came into existence in a society that already had biblical presuppositions about God and the state, about absolute morality, about marriage, and all of these things. You don't find a lot of natural law in existence in primitive African tribes. And so we like to say now, on the other side of a long period of Christian thinking, that natural law is sufficient to order a society, but that was only within the context of a society that had very Christian presuppositions. So.
Yeah, and you think about, you read the testimonies of the faithful missionaries that went to the tribes across the world, and you don't see them coming across a tribe that looked more in keeping with God's natural law. So when Christians go and teach the gospel, along with that, they teach morality, and according to God's law, they say, all right, this is what the implications of your Christian faith are going to mean. You say you believe in Jesus. Now here's how you live it out. Here's how you practice it. If they went to a tribe that, was basically a nudist tribe, that, they didn't see anything wrong with that. The modesty would eventually become a part of the culture. It would, whether by law or just by Christian belief in the Christian principles, modesty would be taught. So you can't separate God's law. And the other point here is if you were to isolate a group of believers to a specific land that they were given, and it was just a group of believers there, and they were tasked with, okay, now come up with a civil law, because you're going to have one. That civil law is going to come from God's word. So Christians would, they could call it natural law or whatever, but they're going to have laws based on God's word. And to Joel's point, that's not whether but which. So we can advocate for our Christian biblical worldview in law. We would rather our society live by God's moral law than any other law, because any other law is not moral. And all law legislates morality. That's what law does. It legislates morality. Right. So I think it's a good point. Now, he brought up the two-step process. So we can't just take Israel's law from the Old Testament and say this law applies to us now. We have to take Israel's law, take it back to the moral law of God in the 10 Commandments. He explained this fairly well. But just to put a kind of fine point on it, we had to take Israel's law back to the Ten Commandments, the moral law, and then interpret that into our current law. And he used the example of seatbelts versus speed limits, and tied that back to the Israeli law of barriers around the rooftops to prevent people from falling off. So we want to implement laws that preserve life. So that'd be a case of speed limits. So we can take that kind of two-step process from Israel back to God's moral law and His intention. And while we're on that, maybe you could speak a little bit about, because it's been really helpful for me to think about this. All of the Ten Commandments are in the negative form: thou shalt not, do not, do not.
Right.
But when you interpret them in the positive sense of those, that's where you start to get into the application of those laws, of those moral laws, in a fine point. Okay, well, this is what, if we are not to murder, what is that saying in the positive form? Do you have anything you want to add to that positive sense? Because I had never really thought about that until recently. It was just, here's the 10 Commandments. Don't do this, don't do that. A list of 10 things you're not supposed to do. But when you think about it in the positive, if we're not supposed to do it, then what are we supposed to do? I think that's a helpful conversation. If you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I'll say two quick things about that. First of all, it actually is somewhat important in the history of kind of political thinking and legal thinking that the 10 Commandments are phrased in the negative, like don't murder, don't steal. The reason why that's important is the idea of negative rights. So when the Christian thinkers and the Reformation, the founding fathers started to come up with the idea of God-given rights, which the Declaration of Independence affirms. And we've been given these rights by our Creator. We have the right to not be murdered, right? We have the right to not be stolen from, that sort of thing. And that's important because there are no positive rights. I don't have a right to health care, right? I don't have a right to have the government give me food every single day. What I have a right to is for someone not to take the food that I have bought or produced. What I have a right to is to have someone not take the life that I'm using to provide for my family, that sort of thing. And so the fact that the commandments are in the negative is important for legal theory because we have negative rights. We are not entitled to things. We are given the right to not have certain things happen to us. But the key that has helped me is this idea that the Old Testament civil law, while we wouldn't just apply it directly straight across 1-to-1, it was an explanation, an attempt to take the moral law in the 10 Commandments and then work it into society. And the way that it worked out was both negative and positive. And so there are situations that say if you kill someone, the obligation of the judge is to rule that you yourself should be killed too. But on the other hand, there are other laws that require that we uphold the sanctity of life, like what you said with the parapets around the rooftop. It wasn't just that they would wait until someone was irresponsible, someone rolled off the roof, and then there was a penalty. No, there was also a proscription to preserve life. And so we do see that the Old Testament law tries to work out the negative laws: don't steal. How do we reinforce that, right? How do we talk about, you should farm your own crops and have your own crops and things like that. And so I don't know if that's what you're talking about, but the picture is, here are the 10 laws, but the civil law was their attempt, God's design for how they as a nation at that time could actively put the law into effect in negative and positive ways.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. There's a lot to unpack there, but and you've done a good job at it. But the basic principle is, when we think about the positive sense of the 10 Commandments, you can get to some. I think Joel might have made mention of it in the interview. Something like 300 and something laws, just based off the Ten Commandments. So they were taking
Yeah.
the negative version of the Ten Commandments and applying that many laws. Now you can take that too far, right? And you could end up with the religious Pharisees that had laws around the laws around the laws around the laws, to prevent you from getting to the ultimate one. So there certainly is wisdom in, and I think that's what you were saying in how you parse it. We can have disagreements on some of those interpretations or how far we take those, but the basic principle is God's moral law that we try and apply to it. We don't try and take like a natural law or the world's law or whatever we want to say. The world dictates its morality. We want to take God's morality and apply that to our current civilization, our current civil law.
Yeah. And so like it is a two-step process, and it would be wrong for us to take the civil law that said that if a woman is found not to be a virgin on her wedding night, she should be executed, right? Why would that be wrong? Well, because what was the moral law that went back to? That actually went back to the command to not commit adultery. Okay. And so the principle there is to honor marriage and to keep marriage holy, which we see in Hebrews. Keep the marriage bed, let it be held in honor. And so the idea was not just a random, oh, let's kill all the promiscuous young ladies. It was an attempt to honor the sanctity of marriage and sex within a marriage. And that goes right back to that commandment. And so it wasn't an arbitrary application. Now, we would not necessarily apply it the exact same way for various reasons. But what we would say is, okay, what can society do to honor and affirm the sanctity of the sexual union between a man and a woman in marriage alone? And then, okay, how much of that is punishable? How much of that is just moral undergirding? But certainly, we would want to always link back to the principle, which is given in the moral law.
Yeah, yeah, and as you say that, before as we transition out of this into your next point, the practical there in our current day is the debate on abortion. The pro-life Christians that come out and say, well, we don't want to punish the mother, but the principle of the pro-life movement is that the child inside the womb has the right to life. It is a living creature and it has the sanctity of life. And you and I have had a conversation that we're kind of confounded at the pro-lifers that would say we want to preserve the life of the baby, but not at the expense of punishing the mother that chooses to abort. And we would look at that and we'd say, no, if the sanctity of life matters, and if we're saying that the child inside is a baby, is a human created by God, then the consequence has to fall in part on the mother for choosing to undergo that. Now, obviously, the abortionist, and I would even go as far. Sorry, I'll finish that thought. The abortionist needs to face the consequence too. I would even go as far as to say that if possible, that the father of that child should face the repercussions of that choice too. Now, it's a little hard to parse that out because you don't know what the mother is doing against the will of the father or even in the ignorance of the father, but we can apply that standard, that way of thinking to, all right, if the value is sanctity of life in the positive sense of do not commit murder, then there has to be consequences for those who choose to violate that positive affirmation of life, even if it is hard on the mother. Like that's just the reality. So that's one area that we can take that, and the debate is going to go on there for a little while, but we can stand firmly on God's law and moral law there.
Yeah, but we already have legal reasoning that is well considered in other areas, because if you are an accessory to a murder but don't pull the trigger, you are guilty in part, but you won't have maybe as high of a sentence or as high of a punishment as the one who actually pulled the trigger. And so there are cases where the murderer is punished and the three other people who helped create the circumstances that got the person murdered in the first place are also punished, but to a lesser extent. And it just doesn't make sense to me that we You would never do this if the child was 1 year old or 2 years old and a mother drove a 1 year old to a place and then allowed someone to shoot that 1 year old in the head. Yes, the shooter is the murderer, but the mother is an accessory, right? And so again, it goes back to God's law, and we need to not be afraid of the consequences. Of course, society will persecute us if we say that, because it's had 50 years of indoctrination. And obviously, a good judge would have the latitude to look and say, okay, was there an abusive father? I just talked to someone a week and a half ago who said she had had an abortion at 19, and it's because she was at home. She didn't have a job. The boy left her, and the father said, if you do not get an abortion, I'm kicking you out of the house and you'll be totally on your own. Like, hopefully a judge would look at that and say, okay, the mom has some capability, but not the same degree of capability as someone who goes down and is bragging about an abortion, and it's purely for convenience and no other reason. Like, there's more moral culpability there for that second mom than the first one, who was really kind of forced into it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're hitting at something really, really valuable there. And it's not that we don't want to extend grace, we don't want to extend kindness. There are obviously, any, like you're saying, any judge is going to have the freedom and the freedom to grant that grace. And ultimately, Christ is that ultimate grace giver, and we are made clean through him. But as we live on earth, there needs to be a standard, and we have a right to that standard. And then as extenuating circumstances come up, we judge those standards as they come up, or those circumstances as they come up. But we have to have the standard in place as a baseline for judges to grant leniency or effectuate the rule of law that's been established. So
I'm just going to disagree with you for 30 seconds.
Go ahead.
And I think I'm just refining what you're saying. It's not that judges grant grace. The government is given the sword, right? It's not given the ministry of mercy and love. However, a well-crafted law has proportional punishment to the crime, and justice is proportional to the crime. And so a wise judge would look at that and say the crime is less for the woman who was pressured into it than for the one who willingly went. And so it's not necessarily grace that the judge is applying, but wisdom to proportionally sentence the amount of guilt that is there.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Yep. I don't have anything to add to that. Thanks for the clarification.
Yep. Well, we're kind of running into our desired time here, so we'll just mention this last one briefly because we've kind of already touched on it. But one of the questions I asked Joel was whether or not living in a way that confronts culture with sin, and then also preaches the gospel, is consistent with living a quiet and peaceable life, like Paul admonishes. And Joel didn't say this. This is just something I was thinking about it afterwards. But Christians are always commanded to live a life that conforms with God's standard, right? So if society is doing grotesque things, Christians are not allowed to. If society is pushing and valuing and promoting grotesque things, Christians are not allowed to. And as that gets pushed and promoted more, Christians not doing it is going to stand out more and more. Now, how are Christians supposed to strive to live a quiet and peaceful life and work with their hands if the society around them has embraced values and lifestyles that are utterly counter to what the good life according to God is, the moral life according to God? So if I'm a baker and I want to honor marriage and I won't bake a cake for a gay wedding, all of a sudden I come into conflict. Well, how am I supposed to live a quiet and peaceful life if that is inevitably going to lead to conflict with the people around me? It will not. And in fact, that's why the church spent the first few centuries under persecution, because they were not willing to sacrifice for comfort if that meant not living the way God wanted them to. However, here's what clicked for me. We are to endeavor to live a quiet and peaceful life and pray that that is possible. And if that's going to happen, it means that society at some level has to be following God's standards to a degree that when we do what is good, they recognize it as what is good. And this is what Paul says. He says, do you want to not be persecuted or punished? Do what is right. That's in Romans 13. Well, that only works if the government and the king in that case also agrees with what is right. If you do what is right, but that's counter to what the king has said is right and good, then you will be punished. So Paul's saying there is a scenario that we should work and pray for where our living consistent, quiet, gentle, peaceful Christian lives also lines up with the societal norms around us, and we can do that. And that's a helpful thing for me, because that's a worthwhile goal to pray for and work for, that society would conform with God's law to some degree, where what is good is promoted and what is evil is punished. And that was a really, again, Joel didn't say that directly, but that was a helpful thing for me to think about as I was reflecting on that part of our discussion.
Yeah, just to put a really fine point on that, what you're saying is the Christian pursuit involves the work that it takes to conform society and civil government in order that the quiet and peaceful life is in accordance with the government. That's not just a hopeful prayer that, oh, maybe the government will be reformed. The Christian works and strives to implement and affect culture in civil government that would allow them that quiet and peaceful life. Because if it doesn't, then, like you said to start, you will come in conflict. You will not be able to live your Christian life in a quiet and peaceful means without conflict.
Right.
So it takes work and it takes effort to get to the point where your quiet and peaceful life is in accordance with the law. And that's never going to be a perfect relationship, but we can strive for it and we can push towards it, especially with a postmil optimism.
Yeah, and I would just add two quick kind of caveats to that. Obviously, number one, that is not quite the same work as the work of evangelism. Like postmillennial, they have the same heart to share the gospel that I do as growing up in a premillennial missionary home. They just want to extend the message a little bit more broadly. Secondly, obviously, the quiet and peaceful life is not the idol. Like, many generations of Christians lived through entire times where their Christian living was at odds for their entire life with what society was doing. And so it's not like we say, okay, well, I'm going to be quiet and peaceful, and so I'm going to totally go along with society. That's a goal to aspire towards, but always obedience to Christ in all things, first of all.
Yeah. No, that's really good. All right. Well, I think we have two big picture implications. We always want to try and get practical as much as possible because we find it important to build, to rebuild. So our first big picture implication is that bringing the law to society leads
God's
to
law. You mean God's law?
Yes, bringing God's law to society leads to evangelism, and this has been something really helpful to me from a premill perspective. And it was more probably a problem in my heart, but there was always that like uncomfortable feeling that any evangelistic opportunity was kind of shoehorned into the conversation. I got to find a way to force the Jesus conversation into whatever talk that I'm having. But what we're saying, and what the postmil would argue, is that when we bring God's law to society, there creates the opportunities for the gospel in a multiple of situations. So when we argue that we want God's law to be implemented, we then have the opportunity to extend that to, because we want you, whoever we're discussing it with, to come into conformity with God's law. We want you to know Jesus the way that we know Jesus. But it comes from a knowledge base. It can come from more than just a shoehorn. We can be having an intellectual, civic discussion or cultural discussion for that matter, and say, no, you know what? I think this is God's law, and it's the way that I want our society to be structured, and it's the way that, honestly, I want you to come into conformity so that you can be saved.
Not saying that the works save you there.
No, not saying that the work saves you, but it creates the opportunity to explain the gospel. It removes the shoehorn from the equation and gives a natural transition into, this is why I want God's law for society, so that man can be saved, not by obeying the law, but by seeing the goodness of God in the law.
Yeah, and we live in a society now where largely most people have now been told that they are good, right? The idea of the doctrine of the total depravity of man has been jettisoned from society. And most people are told whatever decision you make is moral because it's conforming to your true self, or it's helping you live your best life, or that sort of thing. And so there is a real need in our society now to bring God's life. What did Paul say? He said that when the law came, then sin came to life, right? The law, one of the main reasons that God gave us the law was to expose our sin. And so when we stand up as Christians and say, you know what, society, we cannot call a man a woman and a woman a man, because God has defined those terms. And when we do that, we are in rebellion to him. And in fact, I want us to live in a society where men are recognized as men and women are recognized as women. But more than that, I want you to live in conformity to what God has said for your life. And the only way you can do that personally is through the gospel, right? And so when we when we expose the ways in which societally there is rampant sin, rampant rejection of God's standard, that leads to, but though God is angry, there is forgiveness, right? And so, yes, it's good if a society has the blessing, the temporary blessing of strong families and people living, the way God wants them to, but it's better when God's standard is given and some will see the law and they will realize their sin and they will repent. How are they going to repent? How is someone's boss going to repent if you don't say, if a Christian in that workplace doesn't say to the boss, I'm sorry, I cannot go along with your diversity, equity, and inclusion training because it's offensive to God to show favoritism in this way. And if you're going to do that, you have to know that you're under God's wrath, but you don't have to stay under God's wrath. Now, will that Christian lose his job? Maybe, probably, right? But the law, we bring the law as the way that we expose the sin. And when you see Paul in the New Testament, that's what he was doing, right? He was pointing out this cultural sin and that cultural sin, or that, I should say, that sin that was prevalent in that culture. And he was calling it out, and he was pointing out different things in different places on his missionary journeys, and even to different churches, how they're supposed to engage the sins that were rampant in their cities. And the idea that we should not be telling society this, look, I am suspicious of the moral majority and the kind of fake culture war, the fake culture war, as anybody else. But there is a real war for God's truth that Christians ought to engage in. And when we engage in it, then we really have the chance to share the gospel.
Yeah, we're running long here, but you did say something there that made me think the Christians should have the confidence to say that. They should have the knowledge base to say that, which means they have to be informed. And there is the distinct possibility that they might lose their job. But if the Christian is performing their work as to Christ in a Christian manner, if the Christian is a cobbler, a shoe cobbler who happens to be a Christian, making that Christian, it should be extremely difficult for whoever they're interacting with, their boss, to fire them because of the value of their work. So as Christians, our work should be as unto the Lord, so much so that when those hard conversations come up, it is not easy for them to pull the trigger. Not only does it give us credence when we approach them, we have a certain clout and a certain reputation as we approach them. If it does come to the decision of whether or not we lose our job, that decision should be as tough as humanly possible for that person, despite what we're saying. That came to mind, and that's something that's kind of at the heart of all of this, of all of the post-mill, of all of the cultural engagement ideas, is that the Christians should be all the way Christian in everything they do, and they should be taking the principles of Christ and the principles of the Bible into the workplace, and not just being a good Christian in a work environment, but the best worker in that environment because they are a Christian.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. Well, our last kind of practical takeaway is very short. It is simply this, that we as Christians, and I'm especially Christian men, okay, but all of us as Christians, we need to work to cultivate courage and steadfast to God's commands into our friendships. Right? We need to cultivate friendships where we are spurred on to be bold with God's message, both of judgment and of love, right? Both the law and the gospel. And we need friendships where when we do that, our friend will not say, "Ooh, I don't know if you should have told your boss that," but we'll say, "You know what? I'm praying for you." And in a church that would say, "You lost your job for being bold with the gospel. We're gonna come around you and help you until you find another job." And so, we as Christians, I think it's good to have good friends to pray with and have accountability with. That's great. That's necessary. But we also need friends with whom we can stand shoulder to shoulder for the fight of God's truth and God's gospel. And we need to encourage each other to take hard stands sometimes. We need to get advice from each other on when we should take it. We need to have our friends, your friends praying for you when you go and talk to your boss or, whomever it is. But we are in a spiritual battle. The church has been the whole time. But what I would like to challenge us to think about is that we need help being courageous. We need help making these stands. I will never do it alone. But with the people around me encouraging me when I see their example, I'm much more likely to.
Yeah, absolutely. We all have friendships that we cherish that have been long-time friendships. Those are good friendships to have. The goal in those friendships is to be partners in warfare, partners in Christ, and not just in a passive, pray for each other that things go well, but through thick and thin. I've got your back in every way possible. When you are overstepping your bounds, I'm going to call you out for that. And that's a huge part of it too. Not just in I'm going to encourage you to be bold, but in the reeling people in when they need to be reeled in love, and that we know that it's 100%. In it for each other, in it for having each other's back. So cultivate those relationships, take the friendships that you have, and pursue that together. Build new friendships as you find people that come into the same framework. And I would never encourage moving away from friendships, but there are going to be certain friendships that don't have that same pursuit, whether it's just simply they don't agree with you or they lack the courage. I'm not saying get rid of those friends, but the friends that you do have, you need to know are there with you, and those are the ones that you should want to cultivate in the friendship that you would want to pursue to its greatest level. So yeah, cultivate courage through and in and around your friendships.
Yeah, good. Well, I think that just about wraps us up there, right, Bradley?
I don't think I have anything else to add. No.
All right. Well, we really would love to hear from you if you have questions or comments about this. And we really want to thank Pastor Joel again for the time. Again, just to reiterate, we are very much on this journey of trying to learn how to be godly men, and love God and truly love our culture around us by proclaiming his truth and proclaiming his gospel with boldness and with clarity and with resolve. So we hope that's encouraging.
And I would add,
to
you mentioned, thank you, Pastor Joel. Just one more plug for his channel, Right Response Ministries. It's been a tremendous encouragement. There's a lot of content put out there. He puts sermons out through that channel. Even if you just want to go and pick and choose topics that he addresses, he's got 5-minute clips. He's got hour and 20-minute clips. I mean, he covers the contents or the topics and the content thoroughly, but also concisely when you're looking for that quick kind of bullet point conversation. So we've benefited greatly from his heart and his teaching and his content online. So we'd encourage you to go check him out as well at Right Response Ministries.
All right. Well, very good. Thanks, Bradley, and thanks everyone. We'll catch you next time.
Sounds good. See you guys.